I think I've done justice to the wonderful cohort of students that I was very fortunate to be part of the training of. And I must say, we have sadly lost Marjorie Shostak, who died in the 90s. We've lost Henry Harpending, who died, I think, in this year in 2016. He was at the University of Utah. But then Mel Connor, John Yellen, Patricia Draper, Nancy Howell continue to be productive in either in retirement or semi-retirement. Allison Brooks is the name I've been trying to capture. In the 70s, Nancy Howell and I, our marriage broke up. By that point, we had she had given birth to twin boys, David and Alexander. They were born in Toronto, but we were living in Princeton, New Jersey, where she was a assistant professor in the demography department at Princeton, and I was a professor at the anthropology department at Rutgers University, about 15 miles away. But when our marriage broke up, we had these two wonderful young kids in common, and we decided to both move to Toronto, my hometown, but Nancy had many colleagues in the Department of Sociology, so we both took jobs at the University of Toronto, and we continued to raise our children and to a degree in joint custody. So that was 1972. Around the same time, part of Nancy's and my history was when we first fell in love. She was a roommate of one of her housemates. She and several other women had rented a house together. And one of her housemates was, I can't remember her maiden name, but there was a young professor of astronomy at Harvard in the mid-1960s named Carl Sagan. And Carl Sagan and I became friends because he then married Linda, became his second wife, and I married Nancy, and they had been housemates. So we became friends. And when Carl moved to Cornell from Harvard a few years later, we continued to remain in contact. And so in 1970 or 71, I can't remember, he was very interested, and this was getting a fair bit of media coverage, in the question of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, also known as SETI, S-E-T-I, or SETI with a C, communication with extraterrestrial intelligence. And so there was the depth of the Cold War, but there was very concerted efforts by scientists to keep alive channels of communication between the Soviet scientists and the American and other European scientists. And so he contacted me. I was by this time at Rutgers, he was at Cornell, and he said, we've organized a conference with our Russian colleagues in Armenia, and we're going to have a conference on the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Would you like to come and talk about it from an anthropological perspective? And I said, would I? That would be fantastic. And he said, we need one other, can you recommend somebody from your field who might be of interest or who might be interested in this topic? And so I recommended Professor Kent Flannery from the University of Michigan. And Kent Flannery was an archaeologist who worked in Mexico and Peru, and I know he had very broad interests, theoretical interests. So I approached him and he said he'd love to go. So Kent Flannery and I represented the anthropological perspective at this international conference. Among the other people who were attending, and this was like a thrill for me, was Sir Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the DNA molecule, and a physicist from MIT named Philip Morrison. And Phil Morrison was, had this incredible history. He was part of the Manhattan Project and in the 40s, and had a role as a physicist in building the first atomic bomb. But then he became an active supporter of nuclear disarmament. So that was interesting about him. And he was an early, as a Cornell professor, he later went from Cornell to MIT. He was a strong advocate of we should be involved in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So Phil Morrison, and then for many years he was, because he had enormously diverse interests, for many years he was the book review editor of Scientific American. So in addition to doing all this amazing work in theoretical physics, in the politics of nuclear disarmament, he was being the book review editor. And so he was, 1 month he'd review a book in biology, evolutionary biology. The next month he'll review a book in anthropology and so on. Quite one of the most amazing people I've ever met. And so he and Sagan and their Russian counterpart, a name named Joseph Shklovsky, organized this conference in Armenia. So you can imagine, it's 1971. It was pretty amazing. And then Sir Francis Crick and lots of other major, Freeman Dyson, I'm pretty sure, was there. The cosmologist, Freeman Dyson, who was at the Center for Advanced Study at Princeton for many years. Freeman Dyson, I think, yes. So it was a pretty interesting group, and me, a 30-something junior anthropologist, and Kent Flannery were both about the same age, were kind of awestruck. But we both contributed to the conference, and our input is in the book that was published, Communication with Extraterrestrial Intelligence, by Sagan and edited by Sagan and Shklovsky. It came out in the early 70s, and it's still out there. I can't remember which publisher published it. So that was a pretty amazing experience. And then moving to Toronto and continuing my work there, I went back for a third field trip in 1973. And the great days of having large NSF grants were over. I was now back in Canada and going to the field on a shoestring. So I didn't have a vehicle, so I got myself to Maun, Botswana, and I hired a guy. I said, if you'll drive me up to the Dobie area, which was about a day and a half drive, and then leave me there, I'll get around somehow, and then you'll pick me up in 6 weeks. And we agreed on the date he was going to pick me up, because there was nothing like, no radio contact with, this was 1973, and only maybe one vehicle every 2 weeks would come, or one vehicle a week. So it was pretty long range of communication. So I come back, and the first thing that people said to me and I've written about this. And I had just gone through a pretty tough divorce. The first thing they said to me is, "You're old. You're old. You've aged." And I felt, hurt. But then I later came to appreciate that they didn't mean it. Aging was not a negative for them. It was a positive, because life was tough, and if you could survive, you were that was a plus. So they didn't see it. I felt badly, but then I appreciated they didn't mean it bad as an insult. But they said, "You've aged." And then the second thing they said is, "Where's your truck? There's no truck. Where's your truck?" And I said, "Well, this time I have no truck." And it was for them to say, "Oh, wait a minute. There's a European without a truck?" It's sort of like the two go together. They're inseparable. So this was quite interesting, and we got a laugh out of it. And then I said, "Here's my truck." And I pointed to a donkey that I had hired. I had to walk around on. I pointed to a donkey. And then when my old comrade Hakakoshi joined me, he had a donkey. And so they said, "Okay, Richard," and the name they gave me was Tunta. They said, "Tunta has his truck. Here's his truck. Here's his two trucks." And so that was a good joke for them. But in fact, Hakakoshi and I then went all over the area on our donkeys and visited villages. And it's interesting how the atmosphere is different if you arrive on donkey back or you arrive with great fanfare with a truck. One of the things that's kind of interesting is the Kalahari is very flat, and you can hear a truck. You can hear in a distance, you can hear the truck maybe an hour away from you. People are listening. What is that sound? Is it the wind? Oh no, it's a truck. And so in the hour that it takes for the truck to arrive, people have an intense conversation like, who could this be? What truck would this be? And they even have divining bones and discs that they divine with. And while they're listening to the truck, they're using their divining tools to figure out from the lay of how the discs fall, which truck it is. And then if they're right, then they say, "See, the divination works." And if they're wrong, they say, "Well, the divination didn't work this time." Doesn't shake their faith in divination. And so we would just show up on our donkey back. And then I found it very refreshing to just go, like some of the villages were like 20 miles apart, and it would take, you're going about 3-4 miles an hour, so it would take hours and hours on the trail. And so I found it very therapeutic. And coming back to Toronto in the mid-70s, in 1976, Devore and I published our second book together, Kalahari Hunters and Gatherers, and the subtitle is Studies of the Kung San and Their Neighbors. And this is a subtle indication of how the terminology began to shift, because they were the Kung Bushmen in the 60s, but then part of our ethical responsibility is some of the people called Bushmen said, we don't like that term because it makes us seem very inferior, and we don't like that term. And not every Bushman felt that way, but so we said, well, let's look for a different term. And so along with other anthropologists and the people themselves, we picked the local term San, which is a term in another language which means Aborigines or settlers proper. And so we began to call them the Kung San. And So that was the title of the second book that we did, an edited volume, which had all of these people mentioned: Harpending, Yellen, Draper, Shostak, and a number of others. We also had a medical team in the 1960s from South Africa, Stuart Truswell and John Hansen, and they contributed a long chapter on the health conditions of the Jeunoise in the late 60s. And that became a baseline study, since the people we examined then were primarily hunters and gatherers, but the same, or part of the same medical team came back 20 years later, and by the time in the late 80s, when people had already adjusted to a sedentary life. So there was some pretty significant differences between the 1960 study and the 1980 study. And a joint paper was published in the 90s, setting out some of these key differences. So that was another virtue of being able to carry on a longitudinal study. So we had a baseline of sorts in the 60s, and then some of the same team came back in the late 80s and repeated the same observations and noted significant differences. I'll give you an example. The two that stick in my mind is from the early study, we published jointly a paper called Blood Pressures of Kung Bushmen in 1972, in which their finding was that even though in most populations, especially urban populations, blood pressures rise with age, hypertension becomes a problem with aging in North America and Europe. But in the case of the Jeunoise, there was, from 10-year cohorts, there was no rise, no significant rise in blood pressures. By the 80s, that had changed, and there was a significant rise in blood pressure as you went from people in their 20s to the 30s to the 40s to the 50s. So that was interesting, and we attempted to account for that. And the other thing that was interesting is that in the 60s, we did dental examinations, and there was almost no dental caries. There was no cavities. But in the 80s, repeated the dental examinations, and there was lots of cavities. So then the question became, what accounts for these pretty significant changes? So the common element was that they had shifted from a very low carbohydrate diet, which was meat and plant foods from the field, but no grains, to a diet provided largely by government welfare sources that was based on cornmeal or corn flour. And so that became like the core of their diet. So they went from a low carb to a high carb diet. And the carbs apparently had a pretty major impact on their dentition. And then I think the doctors interpreted the rise in blood pressure. So they were beginning to sort of make the transition from people living in an indigenous wildlife circumstance to people whose life, or at least whose diet, was copied that of poor peasants and urbanites, even though they were still living in the country. So air pollution was not an issue for them. So in the 1980s and 90s, I should say that in 1979, I published what was like a vastly expanded version of my doctoral dissertation. It took me 14 years, but I added an enormous amount of material. and a book called The Kung San, Men, Women, and Work in a Foraging Society, which remains my sort of the best I can offer as far as my take on their indigenous way of life. And in that book, because it was primarily ecological, I only have one chapter on social organization, but I have a chapter devoted to material culture, a long chapter devoted to hunting and hunting techniques and hunting returns, a long chapter devoted to gathering, and then 3 chapters devoted to various various aspects of demography and time at work study. And then I also have a chapter on birth spacing and a reproductive chapter. And just on the latter, one of the remarkable things, of many remarkable things about the Junquasi is that in those days they practiced no birth control. They didn't have access to any birth control, either external, mechanical, or the pill or anything like that. But they had extremely long birth spacing. 4 years, for example. It varied around the 4-year mark. So a woman would have a child and then have a normal sex life for several years, and then in the 4th year of the child's life, she would get pregnant again. So there was intense interest in the question of what is causing this with this long birth spacing. And so I should say that in addition to my own research and Nancy Howell's interest in this topic, Mel Connor did some really important work very detailed work on this. The answer is that lactation, the women are extremely strong advocates of nursing breastfeeding, and that lactation appears to suppress ovulation. And so when I first began lecturing on this around North America and talking about this, there were women scientists in the audience who said, well, that didn't work for me. I was breastfeeding and I got pregnant after 8 months, even though I was breastfeeding. And so there was an interesting debate that involved a number of us about, first of all, does it really work? And we had some pretty convincing demographic information, like we collected birth histories from women, and then we carefully sort of established birth dates by various techniques to ascertain long birth spacing. And then the question became, what is the mechanism? And so it seems that, and this is Mel Connor's later research confirms this, that lactation actually reduces when the hormone associated with fertility, it actually reduces it, and the term is called lactational amenorrhea, and actually has been demonstrated to exist. But, and this is the punchline, the women nurse on demand 24/7, so a day and night. Whereas almost other, certainly in North America, you say, oh, it's time for breastfeeding, 3 hours, 4 hours have gone by, and then we'll just give a bottle in the middle of the night so the mother doesn't have to wake up. It doesn't work that way, and you have to have this. And they nursed like 45-minute intervals because the child, the infant, and the mother she was carrying the child in the backpack. So on that note, so that's one more of the interesting things that came up in this long run of field work, birth spacing.